Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and One Take. One Take, my take on a paper or report on air quality, ventilation and the built environment. One Take in that it's done in, well, one take and tries to summarise for you a scientific perspective on something interesting in, well, usually 10 minutes or less, because who has the time to read all these amazing documents, right? This week, I'm digging into the 7th edition of a really important annual report. It's the State of Global Air Quality Funding 2025, produced by the Clean Air Fund and the Climate Policy Initiative. And this is essentially a global health check, but not for people, for policy. It follows the money to see if our global investments actually line up with our stated goals for clean air, for health, and for the climate. And I have to tell you, the diagnosis this year is, well, it's deeply concerning and, frankly, contradictory. It shows a world that's trying to treat a disease with one hand while actively feeding it with another. So let's get into it. The report's core mission is to track the international development funding, the big money from governments and development banks, and see how much of it is going to projects that improve air quality. And this is the first key finding, and it's a bit of a shock. You'd think, with all the talk about the health crisis of air pollution, that funding would be going up, but it's not. Direct funding for projects where the explicit goal is to improve outdoor air quality fell by 20%. It now makes up just 1% of all the international development funding. Just 1%. But that's not even the most jarring part of the story. While that funding is dropping, the report tracks another category, what they call the fossil fuel prolonging funding. This is essentially the money for projects that actively entrench our dependence on fossil fuels, things like gas-fired power plants or expanding fossil fuel infrastructure. And this funding didn't just go up a little bit, it surged by 80% in a single year, reaching 9.5 billion. Let that sink in. In 2023, the World Development Funders spent more than 2.5 times more money on projects that prolong fossil fuel use than they did on projects specifically designed for clean air. It's like trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teacup while someone else is using a power drill to punch holes in the hull. The report highlights Bangladesh, a country with some of the worst air pollution on the planet. In 2023, it received 1.1 billion more in fossil fuel prolonging finance than it did in all the air quality projects combined. The contradiction is just staggering. Now, there's a glimmer of hope in the data, and it comes from a different category. The report calls funding with air quality co-benefits. This is effectively the money for projects whose main goal isn't air quality, but which help it as a happy side effect. Think of a major investment in a city's metro system or a big push for renewable energy. The primary driver might be transport or climate, but the air quality benefits are real. And this funding is growing. It rose by 7% in 2023 to nearly 29 billion. This is where the big opportunity lies. What the report argues, and I think this is so crucial, is that we need to stop letting clean air be a happy accident. The recommendation is to make these co-benefits explicit. Funders need to integrate clean air targets right into the design of these huge transport, energy and infrastructure projects from the very beginning. This way, you're not just hoping for a good outcome, you're engineering it in. And you can maximise the health and climate gains from the money that's already being spent. But that brings us to the final and perhaps most critical finding of the report, the profound inequity of where the money is going, or more accurately, where it's not going. The funding is incredibly concentrated. Just 3 countries, the Philippines, Bangladesh and China, receive 65% of all the direct outdoor air quality funding. Meanwhile, places with the highest levels of pollution are where the report calls funding deserts. The stats here are pretty bleak. Of the 10 countries with the world's highest PM2.5 concentrations, 7 received less than $1 per person in total air quality financing. And the situation in sub-Saharan Africa is particularly dire. In 2023, funding for outdoor air quality projects in the region dropped by a catastrophic 91%. Sub-Saharan Africa now receives less than 1% of the global total. This is happening in a continent that is urbanizing faster than anywhere else, and where the health burden from air pollution is growing exponentially. This isn't just a funding gap, it's a fundamental issue of global justice, where we are failing to provide resources to the people who are most vulnerable. So to wrap this up, my takeaway on the report is that it's a vital if sobering piece of work. The main takeaways are pretty clear. First, we are on a global scale funding the problem more than we are funding the solution. And look, I understand sometimes in developing countries, lifting people out of economic poverty has to be the first goal, giving people financial freedom for education and choices about their family's health has to be the first step. But nonetheless, this disparity in funding has to have a negative impact. Second, the biggest opportunity we have is to be much more intentional about the air quality co-benefits in our massive climate and development projects. And third, the existing funding is not going where it's most desperately needed, creating a dangerous inequity. I think the report's conclusion says it best. Air pollution isn't just an environmental or health issue, but a fundamental development challenge. This document isn't just a collection of data, it's a mirror held up to our global priorities. And right now, that reflection is showing a deep and troubling contradiction. The question it leaves us with: what are we going to do to change the picture? Thanks for listening. This has been this week's episode of One Take. This podcast is not possible without our partners, SafeTraces and Inbiot. Without them, this podcast was to simply not be possible. Thanks a million, and I'll see you again next week.